It often seems that groups of people or organizations have obligations. Intuitively, it might be the obligation of corporations to treat employees, societies, and nature well. And it might be the obligation of states to treat their citizens and other states fairly. It might be the obligation of the affluent and influential to prevent climate catastrophe, and the obligation of people witnessing an assault to join forces and stop it. Why does this matter? Why do collective obligations matter? Well, if an action isn't an obligation, it's not clear that it can be demanded. It's not clear that the putative obligation bearer can be blamed if they do not perform the action. But we do think that we can demand action from groups, and we do think that groups can be blamed when they fail to perform such actions. At least many of us think this. If this is right, then why are collective obligations philosophically interesting and puzzling? To see this, ask what entities we think have moral obligations. Inanimate objects or plants don't seem to have moral obligations, nor simple animals or humans lacking the capacity to govern their actions in response to the recognition of requiring reasons. Positively, this suggests that those things bear obligations that are capable of governing their actions in response to the recognition of requiring reasons. And this suggestion makes sense given that obligations are demands and that failures to discharge obligations ground blame. For reasons responsiveness is a common requirement for blameworthiness, and it's intuitively what's needed to be able to respond to a demand and the reasons behind it. The question then is whether corporations or states or the group consisting of the affluent or the assault witnesses have the capacity to govern themselves in response to requiring moral reasons. And there's a general worry here. Corporations or states or groups like the affluent or the assault witnesses only act because individuals act. They don't govern themselves, it seems. In what follows, I will discuss and introduce a number of distinctions and arguments and positions in the literature. But I will not make references to the literature throughout the presentation. Instead, there is a list of references at the very end and numbers by the titles of the following sections of this presentation, indicating what items on the reference list are relevant for that section. Start now with the first key distinction. It is common to distinguish between agential and non-agential collectives in discussing whether collectives can have obligations. States and certain organizations are corporate agents, or corporations for short, agents acting from their own goals based on their own decision-making procedures, or so many people think. Contrast these groups or these entities with groups like the affluent or the people witnessing an assault. They might perhaps adopt goals and decision-making procedures, but they do not have them at the get-go. And many think that this makes an important difference to whether they can have obligations or not. And we will discuss these two kinds of groups in turn. Start with the question of whether corporate agents can be obligation bearers. The primary worry here is the one already mentioned. What corporations do is an upshot of what individuals do. And perhaps this undermines their ability to govern themselves in response to recognition requiring moral reasons. It is the individuals that govern them. The standard response to this worry is that the corporation can control the individuals who do the work for it. Corporations employ members committed to goals and procedures of the corporation. They formally sanction those who fail to follow procedure. They can leverage incentives and informal pressures of corporate culture, and they can get others to do work that a particular individual won't do. Suppose that we understand decision-making procedures and mechanisms ensuring that procedures are followed as constitutive of the agency of the corporations. Then it's natural to say that when these explain how a corporation behaves in response to requiring moral reasons identified by individuals working for it, the corporation governs itself in response to these reasons. Now, it's an open question when this response is a good one. And there are some other worries about corporate moral agency and corporate agents as obligation bearers. According to one worry, corporations lack conscious experience and thus the reactive attitudes that are constitutive of interpersonal relationships that makes one a member of the moral community. They feel no indignation in response to wrongdoing, nor the pain of guilt when recognizing their own wrongful conduct. Because they're not part of the moral community in the relevant way, they can't bear obligations. Only members of the moral community can. A reply says that while the existence of corporate agents is clearly different from that of a human being, it's not clear that they can't be relevantly bothered by their wrongdoing or relate to individual human beings in ways that can be relevantly morally assessed, say as respectful and disrespectful, and thus be members of the moral community in the relevant sense. Another worry says that corporations lack the capacity to respond to moral reasons. In particular, some businesses are constrained to only be concerned with reasons relevant for profit maximization, and these don't seem to be requiring moral reasons. In response, it can be said that while this is true about some corporate agents, it's not true about others. Many businesses are not only constrained by profit, but can act for other reasons. And states can take into account a wide range of moral reasons, even when they are somewhat constrained by laws and constitution. So at most, this worry hits a subset of all corporate agents. Turn next to the question of whether non-agential groups can be obligation bearers. Can groups that lack commitments to shared decision-making procedures and lack mechanisms upholding such procedures have obligations? Can the affluent and influential or the assault witnesses? The primary worry here is again one of control. What non-agential groups do depends on what their members do. Moreover, non-agential groups do not control the behavior of individuals in a way that corporate agents do. So the worry about control is more pressing for these groups. In addition, there's a worry about responsiveness. Group members might respond to requiring reasons. The individual assault witnesses can, of course, respond to reasons to team up with others to stop the assault. But it's unclear how this responsiveness of the individuals can be the responsiveness of the group, such that it can have an obligation. In response to these worries, it's natural to draw a skeptical conclusion and to say that there are no group obligations in these cases, only individual obligations. But this conclusion is counterintuitive. We naturally attribute group obligations that do not correspond to individual obligations. For example, that the affluent have an obligation to prevent climate catastrophe does not mean that each individual affluent has an obligation to prevent climate catastrophe, as this lies beyond their individual power in almost every case. One might try to reconciliate the skeptical worries about the groups being a moral agent in its own right and intuitions about cases like that, and say that to attribute obligation to phi to a non-agential group is just to attribute obligations on part of group members to contribute towards the group's phi or to help its phi. A problem with this attempted reconciliation is that our attributions of group obligations don't seem to go with attributions of these kinds of individual obligations. Suppose that none of the assault witnesses is willing to respond to the victim's need of protection. Being individually unable to get enough assistance to meaningfully help protect the victim, each individual witness now lacks an obligation to help, or so it seems. Still, their unwillingness to contribute does not undermine our sense that it is their obligation to stop the assault. They should all have been willing, and if they had been, they would have stopped the assault. In response to this problem, we might try a different attempt at reconciliation and say that a non-agential group is obligated to phi just in case the group's phi is morally important and would be ensured in a non-deviant way by the members being adequately responsive to requiring moral reasons. The group has an obligation to do something if it's the important upshot of the members being adequately responsive to reasons. Now, if this condition is satisfied, it seemingly makes sense to demand of the group that a phi, the members, can respond to the reasons for phi-ing and phi together as a result. Moreover, this attempt seems to account for intuitive attributions or obligations in our examples. It seems right that the group of the affluent has an obligation to prevent catastrophic climate change, just insofar as they would do so if responding adequately to requiring reasons. And it seems right that the assault witnesses have an obligation to prevent the assault, just in case they would do so if they were adequately reasons responsive. Now, I find this proposal plausible, but it remains a contested issue whether it makes sense at all to attribute obligations in this way to a group that doesn't have its own control or responsiveness. If you want to dig deeper into this, here are some reading suggestions. There's an introduction to different types of collective responsibility, some accounts and defenses of corporate moral agency and corporate moral obligations, and some criticism of the idea that corporate agents can be moral agents and obligation bearers in their own right. There is also an introduction to the idea that non-agential groups can bear obligations, along with an overview of problems for that idea and various proposed solutions, along with several recent defenses of the idea and some recent criticism.